Hello and welcome to this Thwack Camp session, Data Ops. It's like DevOps, but for data. I'm head geek Thomas LaRock, and with me is fellow head geek Kevin Klein. Say hello, Kevin.
Hey, Tom. Good to see you.
Yes, good to be seen, right? So let's just dive right in. We're not going to waste any time because, well, I love talking about the data. So let's talk about data. But specifically, I think I want to talk about bad data, right? Let's talk about what organizations are facing with unregulated, uncontrolled data, and what's the true cost to an organization that thinks its data is good, but maybe it's not as good as it thinks. Let's start there.
Exactly. It's a huge challenge. And, a lot of people, when they start out early in their career, like in my case, started out as a developer, and I thought the applications were what was really important. But at the end of the day, it's the data that's really important. Many applications have a shelf life that is much, much shorter than the data itself, which is, migrated to a new database, and then a new app is built, and it's used in Power BI or Tableau or Click reports. So getting your data right is essential. And so I'd like to cite a source from McKinsey, the well-known global consulting firm, in which they've done some deep studies on the value of data and the loss of value on data when it's not high quality and not trusted. So when we look at the different survey results that they have analyzed, what we see is that it really, really hurts, especially in situations where we're building out data lakes, where we're building out data integration projects. It's a huge area of growth right now in enterprise IT. Uh, Anytime we're building highly customized applications and databases, anytime we're integrating with many different data points across SaaS applications. So what we see is that if you happen to be working in the finance team, you're probably wasting about 30 to 40% of your time just cleaning up data before you'll trust it. In sales, in operations and things like that, it's about 30%. Same in risk management teams and things like that. They have to go through and revalidate all of the data. Enterprise-wide across the Fortune 500, we're looking at just shy of 30%. And even in the best organizations, the best run, global 50 organizations, they're still losing anywhere from 5 to 10% of their time doing the day-to-day work that they need to do just to clean up the data and get it ready to use. So it's a massive cost across all kinds of organizations, great and small. And because data has such a long lifespan, it keeps penalizing you further and further into the future when you don't have good, clean, validated, and trusted data today.
Yeah, I like to use the phrase that data lasts longer than code, so you should treat it right. Uh, it's interesting how you mentioned finance. That's part of my background. And what I found was even if the data, you could take one particular data point. In my case, I'll reference the data that gets labeled as cash, just
Mm,
cash, CASH, dollars,
right.
money, cash. And it's funny because if you go to the front office team and you say, what does cash mean to you? They have a definition. And if you go to the back office team, what cash means is something slightly different. And they can be off by
Yes.
a few dollars. And that's a different meaning of cash to this other team and to this other. You can have 14 different definitions of what it means for your cash on a specific point in time of a day. So how do you reconcile all of that, right? You all agree it's cash. You just don't necessarily agree to the amount. And it's not necessarily that it's bad data, but this is more about what it means to have good data governance so that everybody understands exactly what you mean when you look at this one particular data point. And this proper data governance, this is hard. This is not an easy thing to tackle, right? I mean,
Right.
I've struggled with it. I think most people do struggle with it. What have you seen, Kevin?
Yeah, absolutely true. And as you say, the process by which we control our data is is very ad hoc in many organizations. It is done according to whatever manager or whatever silo of the business decides at a given time. And then what we see in a successful business as they grow, that's when they begin to run into these kind of stumbling blocks where that team has a different opinion than our team, and it is extremely difficult to reconcile those. And so, one of the things we will touch on today in our session is that good data ops practices supports and is supported by good data governance practices. And so you will rarely find an organization that does one well and doesn't do the other well at all. Typically, what you'll find is a company that is, say, implementing data ops, they've already started to think about data governance. Maybe they've gone a fairly long distance in getting good data governance in place, or at least specific subsets of data governance, like master data management or maybe information lifecycle management. And from there, now they're saying, okay, we recognize the value of data. We recognize how much time and energy it's saving across the company. So let's get really serious about this, continue our data governance process and growth, but let's also begin to implement our data ops behaviors and processes and principles so that we can really have a complete success story when it comes to our data.
So you've mentioned data ops now a couple of times, and well, it's in the title of the session. So maybe we should start talking about data ops. And I'm going to ask that we do a little walk down history or memory lane, if you will. And let's review some of the various methodologies that our industry or software development has had over the past 25 plus years. I'm not saying we're old, I'm just saying we're experienced. And so data ops, now to me, and this could be wrong, you can correct me, and you often do. Data ops comes from DevOps, and DevOps is kind of something I feel came out of what we used to call Agile. How close am I so far with this trip down memory lane?
You're hitting a bullseye.
So talk to us about some of these methodologies. Let's start with Agile and let's walk through the progression and how we got to data ops.
So Agile, is kind of an answer to the old-fashioned way of doing things, still very popular and still very much in use, but it was the way I was taught, which we call the waterfall method, or sometimes SDLC, the software development lifecycle. And so one of the big problems with that is it was slow. And if you found you needed to make a fairly big change late in the process, it was very difficult and onerous to do that. So Agile answered that by shortening the cycles at which we develop our products or software, and also having regular touch points, stand-up meetings, things like that, scrums, and aligning it strictly to business goals. So when we produce software, we go for the minimal viable product, MVP, and then we add to that the different features and requirements necessitated by aligning with those business goals. Whereas with SDLC, we had this very, very long requirements gathering process, and then we had a very long coding process, and it would waterfall down to the next step in the process each time. And so that was slow. It still is slow if you're building things that way. Whereas Agile is much more iterative and much more fast. That got combined with DevOps, as you pointed out, Tom. And so DevOps, as the name implies, is a combination of concepts and processes used by development teams as well as operational teams. Because the other big impediment that software development projects would encounter is that once we go to deploy and put it in production, when it becomes operations concern rather than the development team's concern, we hit all kinds of problems with quality, predictability, scalability, and just the rollout of updates. And so one of the big things that came out of DevOps is the concept of CI/CD, meaning continuous integration, continuous deployment. So now the dev team and the operations team are working together to make those iterative releases very successful each time, compared to the older version in which we would roll out a massive change, every year and a half, and it would just be mind-bogglingly hard and present an enormous number of opportunities to force us to roll back. There's also some other things that are included in the principles of data ops. A lot of inspiration came from the improvement in manufacturing we saw back in the day. So things like lean methodologies, and there's some other ones as well that started to be adapted in the business world. Tom, I think you even have worked with some of those. Is that right?
Yes, you mentioned lean, and that makes me think of my days working in Six Sigma projects.
Mm,
And
right on.
I always enjoyed Six Sigma mostly for the math more than anything else. But the idea that you could, examine the process and try to find ways to, so let's say, minimize costs or maximize productivity or make sure that people don't lose a finger in the machine. Anything of that nature, right? Like Lean and Six Sigma was this way of increasing productivity, efficiency, reducing risk in a lot of areas. And I enjoyed a lot of that work. So when we talk about lean being part of data ops, like I'm all in, right?
Hmm.
And I like the data ops process of the automation of things. So for me, memory lane, if I go back to agile, all I think of is how agile was good in theory but not great in practice because there was still too much of a human element involved in agile. And that's where I see data ops being so great because it said, let me take the good parts of agile, which might only be a scrum meeting if you like those things. Let's take the good part of agile and
Hmm.
proper software development, and let's automate out all these human touch points that we don't need anymore. And that's what I think to me feels like what DevOps really describes. But then on top of that, the data ops part, which is to me the control part of Six Sigma, it's recognizing that there's an anomaly in something and now you need to take action. And of course, this leads to a lot of other things that we'll talk about in lots of other sessions, things like observability. But
Right.
that's a topic for a different session, a different day. We're going to focus on the data ops piece here today. So tell me more, because we talked about data governance, and I want to dive back into that a little bit. Tell me more about can you compare data governance to DevOps? Data ops, data governance, DevOps. I feel I know how they're all related, but I kind of want to hear it from you.
Right. So these are, two areas that are very enjoyable and very interesting to me because they're challenges, but they're challenges that make a lot of sense to how you want to solve them. Think of many of our databases and the silos that those data repositories grow in. Is if you've ever seen those videos of traffic flow in a big Indian city, Mumbai or something like that. To me, it almost looks like the flow of red blood cells in capillaries and veins. I mean, people are just dodging in and out. Somehow it works, but it's free of governance, right? Whereas with when we implement our data governance programs, we're trying to implement things like roundabouts and traffic lights and highways, right? So that everything is controlled and flows well, gets to the right place on time. That's probably where our analogy breaks down. But the idea is with data governance, we are going to solve a bunch of business problems that result from having that kind of hands off, laissez faire approach to data. So we implement steps to improve data quality and to reduce data redundancy. So, an example of that in some companies is they have one team of salespeople who support existing customers. And then they have a different sales team that supports that finds new customers, turns prospects into customers. And there are cases where they each have multiple records, even for a single entity, because now the sales team is sold to a different silo of a gigantic corporation. And that gigantic corporation is known by its acronym, say HP or HP Enterprise. And it's also known by its name, Hewlett Packard. So there might be one business unit that is in the customer support team and a different set of records, possibly two or three or four, in the sales prospecting team. So that's one of many aspects of data governance, but we have lots of other ones that make a lot of sense. For example, what do we do with our data that has a very limited number of people who should be able to query that data? Or what if we have another group of people who can see a lot of that data, but not these four columns in the data? So now we need to implement data masking or perhaps different kinds of security or encryption that we wouldn't have to do otherwise. Well, if you don't plan that from the start, it's going to get very confusing and you're going to be making people angry because they're going to be refused data that is important to them to accomplish their job. But on the other hand, if you show too much, then you're going to be giving away information that is rightly supposed to be very secured. So data governance not only improves the quality of the data, who can access the data, but it also ensures that we do things like comply with any legal requirements. And it helps us when we have lots of legal jurisdictions in which we have to deal with that concern. So, for example, here in the United States, we have certain states that have different requirements than others. And then if we look at the international scene, lots of countries have been implementing usually similar sets of laws, but in some cases, some are very different from others. So if you wanted to comply with GDPR in Europe, you might have a different set of laws that you need to comply with in the British Isles, in Great Britain, or in Brazil compared to the United States. Data governance enables us to build this really robust platform for data analytics. But the flip side is when we talk about data ops, is that data ops is less about these very, very specific sorts of best practices for data governance, things like data quality, information lifecycle management, master data and reference management systems. You'll find lots of tools that will help you accomplish those specific goals. With data ops, it's more about best practices and it adheres to a set of principles. So things like establishing progress and performance measurements at every stage of your data flow. So that's important because many people in big enterprises that have a lot of data that they are concerned about, they only think of the data as being important to them at their stage, right? So I, as the sales team, only care about it when I'm entering a new record for a prospect that I've just brought in as a sale. Okay, I'm done. But guess what? Every level of management through the company cares a lot about the sales data, all the way up to the C-suite, right? To the CEO and the CRO, Chief Revenue Officer, Chief Financial Officer. And so data ops helps make sure that every stage of that data lifecycle is supported properly. It defines rules about the semantic layers. So as you pointed out, you might talk to the front office about cash, and they only think petty cash, the little lockbox that's got some money in it. You go to the back office, and they're thinking cash about somebody, signing a check rather than working out a PO that has payments for a particular big sales deal or something along those lines. Another key aspect of data ops, which is something that is interesting and engaging for both you and me, is that we automate as much of this as we can. Again, another example from my career was we were building a big database application. The dev team that was building, I was a DBA on the team. The dev team that was building it had a pretty large set of data they called the factory data. And what they meant by that is every customer who got this data, this application, there were certain tables that were already pre-populated from the factory, from the developers who made it. So the list of all the postal codes around the world, it was a pretty big table. A list of all the different principalities, countries, nationalities, legal jurisdictions around the world. So there was a lot of data that was already included with the application, even though it was empty of any end user application data. And so that's the kind of thing that you want to keep an eye on and automate, right? So if in your testing and in your quality control with data ops is that you have this kind of base set of data that is always going to be present. And you're going to have like these automated QA tests and different kinds of unit testing that will always make sure that data is there. What happens when it's not there? Well, you've built a test case for that so that it'll kick out data entry records when the important factory data in that example isn't present.
So, Kevin, since you mentioned factory, it makes me think of a product that we have here. And so I want to segue over to, let's talk about how SolarWinds helps people that are trying to get into data ops, right? More importantly, to me, if you want to be successful with data ops, you've got to have a foothold somewhere with a data governance strategy, right?
Right.
And so SolarWinds has a couple of products that can help with all of this. And why don't we, in the time we have left, let's look at a couple of these. Let's start with Database Mapper.
Yes.
So Database Mapper. Let's speak to what we're looking at here. Is, first of all, I think what's very important for people to understand is how Database Mapper helps. It supports multi-platforms, right? So we're not just talking about getting data out of one database, but we're also talking about getting data from, say, files, right?
Yes. In fact, it could be many different kinds of sources, I guess you could say. It could be an Oracle database, it could be a SQL database, a SQL Server database. It could be a MySQL database or a PostgreSQL database. At the most fundamental level, one of the big issues that siloed teams have is when they haven't even thought about a data dictionary. They just design all their tables on the fly as they're building their application. And so one database has email address and it's variable character 128 in size. Maybe they've got email address appearing in several different tables, one for customers, one for employees, one for vendors. And it's not even the same data type and size across each of those within a single database. But it becomes even more important that we regulate that at the database level, but across databases too. And so at the
Right.
most fundamental level, that's one of the things Database Mapper will do is build that data dictionary for you.
So I think what you're hitting at, though, is understanding that you have those columns in all those different databases, is the fact that with Database Mapper, you can measure or have an idea of the impact of a change that you might want to make. You
Absolutely
think
true.
you're going to make this change to this one column in this one database over here, but it's going to impact, say, 13 other things. And with Database Mapper, you'll have a better understanding of that.
Absolutely. For example, let's say you have a system that we have a point of sale terminals, flat files that come from these terminals all across our retail operations. We have a process that goes and fetches them and pulls them into one SQL Server database, a staging database, munges through all that data in an automated way. And then we have an SSIS job that moves that over to a SQL Server Analysis Services database. And then that multidimensional cube is also used for a lot of report processing. Maybe you use Tableau, maybe you use Power BI or Qlik or something like that. Someone who controls the field operation says, okay, well, we need to add a new field in here because we're now processing all, credit cards that have the chip in it, and there's some extra detail we need to add that we didn't in the past. Now that has downstream implications because, well, we want to capture that during the process of ingestion. We want to transform that in the staging server. We want to move that over to the analysis services machine. And yet, wow, we have different steps throughout where we're going to have to add a field, or maybe there's an existing field we can reuse that we need to make some changes to. And so with a click of a button inside of Database Mapper, you can do that analysis in both directions. So on the one hand, we could look at data lineage. So that would be where we start maybe towards the end of the process. Okay, in our Tableau report, Power BI report, we have a field that seems to be getting cut off all the time. It's 200 characters long. Well, let's look at our data lineage and we see, oh, way back here at the staging server, it's actually a 500 character long field. But somehow it got changed to 200 down the line. So based on our lineage, we actually know there's more data. We can go back and we can unlock the additional character length of those fields. So that's the data lineage process. The flip side is impact analysis, as you said. So if we make a change way up here in our workflow, what other parts branching off from that and descended from that are going to need to be adjusted as well. It's a very powerful feature. It makes a lot of people very happy when they see they can do this. One other thing that kind of goes to the mantra of data ops too is that you can automate this process. So you could take daily or weekly snapshots and compare today to yesterday to see if there were any changes and have it notify you and go from there.
So you hinted upon the automation of some of this and click of a button, understanding the impact, all that. Let's talk about how we can help with the automation piece, right? So let's talk about Task Factory and how that really helps folks who are living in that data ops world.
Yes. So as we talked about earlier with data ops, data integration is a really, really important part of it. And we find today in our modern world that our database systems are, I don't want to use the word fragmented, because in a sense they're more cohesive than ever. But what we do have is a situation in which we're mixing and matching data sources in ways we never did in the past. For example, in the early days of the internet, we didn't have software as a service, but now you can use Salesforce or Google Analytics or Paycor or all kinds of different applications that are online. And as you would expect, you own your data up there. So I want to pull it down into my systems and do analysis on that kind of data. And so that's a very common challenge that many organizations face. And when they go into the process of saying, okay, we're going to go into Google Analytics for our website information, or we're going to go to Marketo for our marketing information, it takes them days or weeks to build those data engineering components that can pull down those specific sets of data. So what we have with Task Factory are easily implementable packages that you can use in SSIS, integration services, or in Azure Data Factory. And you can just plug them right in. There's over 70 of them. And they do a myriad array of data integration, like with those different software vendors, as well as other really, really powerful time-saving steps that would normally take an enormous amount of time for you to program and vet, put into production. It's all done and dusted for you. And so all of our customers who use it love it. They swear by it because it saves so much time and it's so easy for them to implement and automate.
Well, Kevin, thanks for your time today. Really appreciate having you here, talking a little data ops. I'm always happy to talk about data ops, data governance. These are things near and dear to my heart. And I appreciate you helping us walk through a little bit of Database Mapper and Task Factory. And I encourage anybody watching to check out those products and learn more about how they can help you with whatever you're trying to accomplish at your company. And for THWAC Camp, for my fellow head geek, Kevin Klein, this is Thomas LaRock, and I thank you for attending.
Thank you. See ya.